All right. How's it going, Vin? Doing all right
Good.
today?
Yeah. Everything's good. Excited to have this conversation with you. I think it's a good one and it's timely, so that's
Yeah.
always good.
Yeah. I definitely think that kind of with everything that I've seen going on, when you talked about the matriarchy thing, that's what really sparked. I was like, I think there's just something that people need to talk about for sure.
Well,
Um,
we're gonna all have to start talking about it, but here's what's interesting. We are experiencing something new. I think that everybody understands that what's going on in Western culture right now
mhm,
is something that we haven't seen before. It's a brand new manifestation of something. But I
mhm,
think we're struggling right now. So we're embodying this whole thing. Whether we like it or not, we're in the middle of it and it's not going anywhere, right?
yeah.
So we're embodying something. Some phenomenon or mixture of phenomena are coming together all as one. And I think, interestingly enough, it's been through my experience with cryptocurrency and the blockchain and doing some development and understanding this new way of thinking that's inside of that, or not even a new way, but a new manifestation of an old way of thinking,
Mhm,
using new technology that's brought me to a realization where I think, at least I want to start a conversation of starting to articulate the things that I'm seeing, which we're going to have this conversation. And the one thing that I want to say up front for the people who are listening is that by no means am I saying that I have this whole thing figured out of what it is that we're looking at. But I do think that I at least maybe have some starting point kernels that feel right, that seem to stand up to that sort of gut instinct that you're talking about. And so yeah, I want to lay that out from the beginning though first, that like I'm hoping that we're starting a conversation here where we can all start to participate in unlocking some answers to what's going on, and maybe to helping this be a little more smooth in our culture.
mhm. Yeah. And so for those of my listeners who don't know you, could you give me a little bit of a background on who you are and, what you're doing right now with your podcast and everything?
Sure. So, most people right now who are listening to this probably know me from my podcast, The Vin Armani Show. Most
Mhm.
people in the world who know of me, though, know me as a star of a show that was on Showtime called Gigolos for 6 seasons, started in like 2010. Um, so, it's been a bit of a transition, but being going through that adventure was my background is a software developer, so I've had this kind of very interesting arc. And I think that being able to have what I would call a healthy amount of celebrity.
Yeah.
So I view that as like, I do get stopped on the street pretty much any time that I spend a significant amount of time in public. So I travel a lot. When I'm in airports, I will get stopped pretty much every single flight that I take. If I'm out, just out and about in a relatively crowded place, people will stop and be like, "Can I take your picture?" And this has happened all over the world. The show's in 24 markets, but I have never had my face in a tabloid. I have never been on, Access Hollywood. I've never been embroiled in any kind of a scandal. I don't have crazy stalkers that I have to worry about. So I view that as like just the perfect amount of celebrity to be able to experience what that actually is, to have that frame of reference, and then for it to be able to open some doors. So it's been very cool transitioning into more of a libertarian, but I view myself as coming from a libertarian from a spiritual. It's a spiritual experience for me, much less a political ideology. And so this is what I believe on a moral and ethical. This is what meshes with my own beliefs. So it's been a great experience to transition into that, and that's where I am now.
Yeah.
Being able to spend more time writing. I have that luxury, working on software projects in the cryptocurrency space. So we've got some great projects we're working on there, and it's just being able to live a life that's integrated and that's very holistically aligned in my actions with my beliefs as well. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, for as far as your writing goes, I read your book recently, the self ownership, and um, I think that one of the keys is that you bring up in there, obviously, is the idea of the crypto savage.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's probably good to talk about that a little bit because I think that as you're talking about, kind of looking at all the phenomenon that's going around with the matriarchy and everything, I think that looking at it through the lens of the crypto savage and building the, basically what that is. I think, the whole idea of you're creating the culture within a culture right now is what's going on. And when you have to look at the other culture and see, how you have to react to it, obviously, if you're going to be the savage within it. And so I think I haven't obviously described what crypto savage is. So if you could talk about that real fast, because people are probably losing me where I'm talking.
Sure. And I think that it's an important place to it's a good jumping off point. It's an important place to start. It's really where I end my book, Self-Ownership, off, which I wanted to do. So self-ownership, I wanted to do and I wanted to expound on the idea of what is ownership, because as a libertarian and as somebody who is basically a huge proponent of the ideas of Austrian economics, understanding that private property and the ability to have a sort of a private property order, and to understand that as it extends all the way down into a sort of bodily autonomy, and the idea that libertarians always say, well, there's self-ownership, you own yourself. But what I never heard expounded by thinkers, they would just jump right over it, is, well, we say you own yourself or you own property, but what is ownership anyway? Like, define ownership. Yeah. Because if you don't do that, then like really anybody can blow the argument apart. So that's basically what the book is. But as I struggled through the book, truly, and it was like to go into these things and really try to get some revealed knowledge and some revealed wisdom to come out, I started to see that, wow, there is this entire culture that is rising within our own culture. And looking at the evolution of cultures, looking back, because I had to go back and particularly look at where did the American experience start. Libertarianism it's an American phenomenon, and so I had to go back and look at that, and I saw that so much of it is this contact with the savage, with these other cultures that are not our own, and that the modern era has been shaped by the mixing and the mingling of cultures, particularly through global trade and conquest. And we see the great civilizations of the past, they've always taken on things from other cultures, and they've taken the best of cultures, sometimes even things that clash. And so the evolution of culture, when it's a fast evolution, I don't want to even call it evolution, because in this context it's really a revolution. When there are cultural revolutions, which is something that the ideas of liberty really have truly been, they've been revolutionary ideas that have come all at once, and they've come from a small minority of people and they've taken over. When that happens, it's generally the meeting and the ingestion into an old culture of the culture of the savage, and that there have been the talented people who have been able to go out either through space by traveling to places like Marco Polo and bringing things back. I mean, Marco Polo supposedly brought pasta to Italy. You know what I mean? Yeah. So what would Italian food be without pasta? That's a revolution. Yeah. That's the influx of the savage. Or whether it's traveling through time and bringing things back, which is very much what the founding fathers of America were doing, traveling back in time to Rome, to Greece, to pull these ideas back, right? That's the Renaissance. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment too, but the Renaissance in particular was the first time that there was that influx into Europe, and it was a revolutionary time. So whenever you have that, it's the influx of the savage, but we're now in a global culture. Mm-hmm. And so in order for this culture to change, in order for there to be revolutionary change, that means that it actually has to come from within the culture itself. Mm-hmm. And whether that's subcultures, whatever you would like to call it, more and more you're seeing even subcultures being homogenized, because they're all on, I mean, I was part of the rave culture very, very early on in the 90s when I was in my teens. And I remember going out into the desert, to these desert raves under the full moon, and you had to drive for hours, and there was a map point, and it was very kind of secretive. Sometimes it would get broken up by the Bureau of Land Management. This is what went on to become, these people of Moon Tribe and Integral went on to become Burning Man, which is now a global cultural phenomenon. But at this time, this is like a bunch of people out in the middle of the dust in the Mojave Desert under the full moon. You've got your DJ. It's all powered on generators, and there's maybe 20 or 30 people at each of these parties, right? So nowadays, if you think about something like that happening, it would be instantly on Instagram, right? Yeah. Everybody, the second that they're there, is going to be taking pictures. I'm in the desert. They're going to be tagging themselves on their GPS, all of this. You can't have these what Hakim Bey, the anarchist theorist, called temporary autonomous zones. He's got a book called TAZ, Temporary Autonomous Zones, where he talks about this idea. We no longer really have the capability for the savage to be bred in that way, in that same way, completely disconnected, and these new cultures that can then grow to a point and be protected to a point where they can spread on. So what we have is we have a new kind of savage. So that was still the old savage, right? The subculture that was able to be created and grow enough to be a new culture that could then come and clash. And that's, you get the introduction of something like the things that are going on at Burning Man that can then become a cultural phenomenon. So now we have something that's a little bit different, and it's much more virtual. And I think that in many ways it's happening. We are members of those other cultures without even our knowledge. So we are seeing a fracturing off of, for instance, social media. I've seen graphs where people are looking at sort of right and left and seeing how much of each other's content they're actually seeing. And we're very much siloed into our belief. And, YouTube algorithms do that as well, to where if you love cat videos, you would think that the only videos in the world, since you're on YouTube, are cat videos. I have my SoundCloud account, and if I go through my feed, it's only feeding me music that's basically what I like. And I would think that's like, there's no country on my feed, but I know that there's a ton of country music on SoundCloud.
Yeah.
So we're getting siloed into these little areas. And I think that what the person who's able to step back away from that, that's the conversation that we're having now, to step back away, to see, yes, while I am participating in this, I am also able to participate as an observer, perhaps to understand the mechanisms of these things going on, and then to move back into my own culture, my own subculture, and to make some changes in that way. And that's the new savagery. That's the crypto savage. And I think that movement and that idea is definitely growing.
Well, and I think too, that's something that if you look at the founding fathers, they interacted with it in the same way. They considered themselves British. I mean, up until the point where, the Declaration of Independence is really when they said, okay, we're American now. But they were building these ideas. They were working with it. They were defending the guys, James Madison defended the British soldiers who did the Boston Massacre, in court. And so they were a part of that, but they're creating this thing on the outside. And I think that's where now it's happening in the technology space. It's not happening in boardrooms and with the, you have to have the right light and the password. No, you have to be in the right platform and with the right groups there, and you can really find it. And I think the crazy thing you talked about, it's almost like subcultures are absorbed into the culture. Like our culture is almost like, it's just a culture of subcultures at this point. It feels like
that's that siloing. That's that siloing, right? And some people call it tribalism, I guess. Mm-hmm. But it's not necessarily. It is. Because human beings naturally, that is one of our organizational structures, is the tribe, and it's such an old organizational structure that we naturally do flow into that extended family group. But what's interesting is so many of those tribes never interact with each other, right? They are completely, although they are instantly connectable, right? They're operating on the same network. They will never, ever, ever even know that the other one exists. But what we are reaching now is it's broader than tribalism. I don't think that the conflicts that are happening in our society, some people are saying, oh, well, it's just devolving into tribalism. I think that does happen within the subcultures, but the conflict that we're seeing, this conflict arc that we're seeing in our society, I do not think that it has anything to do with tribalism. I think that it's a shift in energy that's coming from an evolution of technology. I think that's what we're gonna get into. But
Yeah.
I do want to start out with that to say that I don't think that it's necessarily an issue of tribalism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at, like you said, with the feeds that things give you, like if you go on Instagram and you're following a bunch of fitness people,
That's right.
then, you know, you're going to get like, that's what's going to pop up in your suggest. If you follow a bunch of musicians, or like, you know, I follow like kind of like artists, or like I follow this artist and now I get all these hula hoop videos because he does like kind of, he like basically trips and does art. And so now they're like, oh, you probably like hula hoop girls. And I'm like, not really, but it's that same culture. I'm like, that's not the videos that I'm really wanting, but because you're like this thing, you know, this is part of that culture, you know. And I think that none of those people have an issue with the others being there, right? They just want to engage with their culture and they get that. But I don't think that there's a tribe there, but that tribe is peaceful with the gym fitness people aren't mad that there's, you know, that other thing there as well, like the rave culture. You know, they don't clash in that way. I think, like you're saying, it's something more, something different, because I think that the cultures are happy to be their own niche in the internet space and just do their thing and engage with who they want to engage with. But there's something else that's creating the strife and the problems. And I think honestly, it's a bit of like an old culture sort of thing. Like there's a pushback against that because it's not compatible with where we're going.
I mean, we're always going to have some degree of pushback from the old culture to the new. That's just that sort of Hegelian dialectic of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So you end up with like, you know, a prime example, music. You know, music has been a passion of mine for a very, very long time. And watching the evolution of music is to truly watch the evolution of culture. And so you have, you know, the famous, basically the inventor of rock and roll, you could say, Sam Phillips, Sun Records. You have the sort of thesis of, you know, his passion was he wanted to bring, I mean, when he was a kid, he worked in the cotton fields and he was like, he heard the music that, you know, that the black people in the South were doing. And as a young white kid, he had never been exposed to this because it wasn't being recorded. That's what you have to remember. So it was like, he's like, what is this crazy, beautiful music? And so he dedicated his whole life to recording it. And so you had him recording so many of these black artists and putting it out, but yet that was never going to get into the mainstream, right? So that was the thesis. Then you had the antithesis coming back from out of the South that's like, this is inappropriate. This has nothing to do with us. And then you have the synthesis, and that synthesis in the U.S. was Elvis, who also Sam recognized and brought it in. And then it was like, oh, that's enough of a combination of the two for this to be a cultural phenomenon. Boom. Same sort of situation with the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It's the same story. And so you're always going to have that. But that is the growth and growing pains of the evolution of a culture. That is not a war within the culture itself, right? Because the culture is either ready or it's not. It's either ready or it's not. With something like rock and roll, the culture's either ready or not. So it's while you will have pushback from the old culture, you're not going to have a cultural war. The same thing is true with the rise of, say, new religions, you know, the rise of the Mormons, the rise of Scientology, right? There's going to be pushback from the establishment. And it's either going to take hold or it's not going to take hold. The people are either ready or they're not ready. But that's not what we're seeing. That's not the change that's happening within the culture, where people within the culture who are not necessarily invested in a particular tribal outcome. So it's not people who are in a particular industry fighting against some new novel thing in an industry. It's people holding two views. Both of those views are concurrent with each other. One is not a new view and one is not an old view. As a matter of fact, both of them are drawing on old ideas. They're drawing on well-worn, well-established ideas, but they're both clashing with each other. And I think that what that is really a marker of is it's a marker of a change in technology that has thrown the balance between the two basic organizational structures that human beings use. We've seen this clash many times through history. It's always when communication technology changes, and it changes the balance. So in stable human societies, what you basically have is you have two organizational structures that have existed for as long, they're as part of the human experience as humanity itself. In fact, they may be what it is that defines us as human beings. And those two organizational structures that we have, and we use them in various different ways throughout our daily life, we don't even recognize it. But it's how we assess our reality as social creatures interacting with each other. And the first one is consensus. And consensus is, there's so many examples of consensus. Language itself is an example of consensus. Why do the letters C-A-T, why are those pronounced cat, and why does it signify this little animal that's walking in front of me? Who the hell knows? It's just that we all over time have accepted it, and consensus evolves. So we have a great many things like that. Nature reflects that as well. Why do we have five fingers on our hand? That's consensus. Over time, nature has decided that's from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So evolution, that's the first thing. When we talk about consensus, we're talking about an evolutionary model and an organizational structure that is basically based on the idea of, well, that's just how we all do it. That's how we've always done it. That's how we do it. And that changes very, very slowly. I mean, you think of how long it takes for a language to change from one language, we have a root of Romance languages in Latin. Like, how long does it take to move from Latin to English? And it's not that anybody's like saying, oh, you have to do this, or when does it split? When does Portuguese split from Spanish, and how and why? Who knows? That's just consensus, okay? So that's the first organizational structure. And the second organizational structure, or the way of defining reality, is authority. And what authority ends up breeding a chain of command, which looks like a hierarchy. Now, authority is very, very useful in certain situations. And one of the reasons that it's useful is because it's very fast to change. Because all you do is you send an order, we're moving left, and you send it down the chain of the hierarchy. One man can say, move left, and an army moves left, because you have a chain of command. And that same man can immediately say, no, retreat. And everybody retreats, because you have a chain of command of authority. You start here, here's authority here that answers to less authority here, that answers to less authority here, that answers to less authority here. And that hierarchy evolved. Again, the hierarchical structure evolved from consensus. Right? So it's an evolutionary structure, but that allows for authority. And at the same time, in the consensus model, you also at times need authority, because whenever something new comes in that you don't know, that you don't have an answer to by consensus, you need to look to an authority. So it's like, while I may know that CAT is cat, if I'm walking through the Amazon and some animal goes running by that I've never seen and that looks crazy, well, there's going to need to be an authority to name that, right? A zoologist or a biologist. And then he says, oh, that's a ring-tailed lemur, and I'm like, oh, ring-tailed lemur, great. Well, thank God I had authority, because within my culture of consensus, we don't even have a word for that in our language. Right? So this is the interplay between the two. And when you have a stable society, that interplay is in balance, right? They're sort of checking and balancing themselves. Authority rises from consensus, and then consensus brings it down if it rises to a level of tyranny, because you wouldn't want authority over something like language, where there would be somebody who tomorrow could say, no, CAT is pronounced dog.
We have that too right now. I mean, we pretty much, I mean, political correctness is an authority.
Well, this is the key, right? Yeah. This is the key that you don't. I mean, this was the big Jordan Peterson thing, where really, you know, he was speaking for consensus against authority trying to take from consensus. But I think that that the kernel that's in there is he talks a lot about the value of hierarchies, but he doesn't realize that he's actually anti-hierarchy in the wrong situation and pro-consensus in a different situation, which is how it should be. And so how I've talked about it is you have this consensus, which is decentralized, non-hierarchical. Everybody's on the same level, right? It's just as valid. In terms of my ability to determine what the meaning of CAT is, it's as much as Donald Trump's. It's as much as yours. It's as much as anybody on the face of the planet to be able to change what CAT, how it is pronounced and how it's signified, right? That is consensus. It puts us all on the same level. And then authority being hierarchical. So these structures, these organizational structures have shaped us over time, even to the point of shaping our biology. But since we have a division of labor, and we have a division of labor by sex in our particular species, it has just so turned out that in the foraging, raising of children, village life, organizational structure, that has been, for the most part, consensus-based. That has been the most successful. That's what's evolved. For hunting large animals, for organizing groups to be able to fight in wars and to defend your tribe, hierarchical structures have been the most effective. And so the men who have been the most apt within a hierarchical structure have been the one that have survived. That's even changed our biology to reflect that. The women who have been the most effective in communicating and organizing in the decentralized, consensus-based model have been the most successful. Therefore, they have been the ones that survived. That has even shaped their biology. And so we come to a point where we have something that we say, oh, this is a male energy, this is a female energy. Not really. Not really. Yeah. It's a consensus, decentralized energy, and it's a hierarchical authoritative energy. Yeah. But it just so happens that because those two energies have affected over time the biology and psychology, physiology of males and females differently, then we can say there's a matriarchy, this energy, and there's a patriarchy, this energy. And it's a very good shorthand. So I wanted to go through lay that whole thing out, because if I just start with the words matriarchy and patriarchy in this current environment, it creates a lot of problems because those are loaded.
Yeah, they definitely are. And I think in any conversation, you really have to define what you're talking about up front. I mean, because any word anything now, it seems very easy that it can be interpreted different ways. It applies differently. But I definitely think that the male and female energies that we have, that patriarchy and matriarchy, like you said, they're complementary. And I think that there's something that's rooted in the way, really, like you said, nature works, in the way that our universe is organized. And we've taken on the two roles, basically, is what you're saying. So we've kind of assigned the patriarchy to men and the matriarchy idea to women. And
well, because we're better suited, right? Because over time, so females, just by the fact that in our evolutionary history, a woman was going to either be, for basically her entire adult life, she was either going to be pregnant or caring for children. Yeah. That was that. We take that for granted at this point in our evolution, but that truly is what changed, why there is a difference between men and women. That why we have such a high level of sexual dimorphism is really due to the fact that young human children require years and years of care, and female gestation and birth is difficult. Yeah. And because of that, the structure that worked over time for keeping little humans alive long enough for them to grow into adults is women stay relatively close to the village. They handle it in our hunter-gatherer times. They would be more foraging, so gathering.
Yeah.
They would be staying close because you can't go too far with young children. That's not safe. They would be in very close groups with one another, where it was important that every single woman had all of the knowledge of every other woman. So this is super, super important that people don't think about. You're in a village. Let's say there's a group of 10 women and all the children. It's very important that every single one of those women know everything that's going on with all of their children, because they're all taking care of all of the children. They need to know if, oh, this kid, he likes to run off into the brush. We need to be watching out for him. He likes to put stuff in his mouth. We need to be. The women that did that over time, those were the women whose children survived. Those were the tribes that survived, and the children were able to survive. So women, the female psychology over time evolved to have this sort of whisper network, to have this system of gossip, to have this. This is why even today, they measure the number of words that the average woman says in a day and an average man. And it's something like men say 15%. Probably not me, but men say 15%, maybe so, because I have these conversations and I shut up for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not on the phone talking to people, but so many women that I know, they spend almost all of their day. They have a strong desire that they need to reach out to their girlfriends and talk about, we men were like, what the hell are you even talking about?
Yeah.
We think there's nothing meaningful in there. But their whole psychology evolved that it's like, I need to get every single nugget of information that is in the women around me, that is in their head. We have to have consensus. Mm-hmm. Just like the blockchain. We've all got to be sharing the exact same copy of the blockchain. Mm-hmm. Now with men, so because the women had to be there and because they could take care of the village in our ancestral time, we're talking over the course of 1 million years here, right? Like, this is not the modern time. This is when our biology evolved. Because they could do that, that meant that the external, the going and hunting, the going and finding things that were outside of the range of what children could do, the protecting of, so we think of hunting, but at the same time, the amount of land that you have to be in control of, basically, in order for you to be able to effectively hunt is vast.
Yeah.
I mean, it's vast. It's, for just a village of people that's maybe 100, let's say it's a total of 100 people, you'd have to have maybe 20-mile radius around you that you had to keep other tribes from hunting game in there so that the game could grow. They knew this.
Yeah.
So to be able to patrol, to be able to go out and do all of these things, I mean, even chimpanzees do this. That was all men. And the things that were required, greater upper body strength. Also, one of the things that men do that women don't necessarily do is, and it comes from this authority hierarchy, and you'll see this, like if you play sports, if you play team sports, you may hate one of the guys on your team. Like when you're just in personal stuff, you may think he's the biggest asshole on earth. But when it comes time for you to play as a team, all of that goes out the window. And even in those moments when things go right and there's celebration, you will celebrate together and be the best of. I have felt my own biology in those moments undeniably change to where I'm like, oh, I think I actually like this guy. Yeah. Like, I think we're actually friends. And then literally 48 hours later, I'm like, oh, nope, he's a dick.
Yeah.
I don't like him.
Yeah.
That's how deeply embedded into the male psychology that is, and to where we're able to have friends get into a fight, and then it's like, you guys handle it, and not keep a grudge.
Yeah.
Because that's an authority model that's needed for this hierarchical, authoritative organizational structure. So this is how deeply over time, and I think that this is an important conversation to start having, especially among these people who are like, there's no biological difference between men and women. And it's like, listen, it's so much deeper than that. But the problem that they have is that we're not presenting a context of, well, why might there be some differences between men and women? Like, what are some good reasons? And then what are some examples that back up that idea? And I think that starting to talk about this, particularly in a vein where we have now a big, it's really a conversation about decentralization and consensus that came from out of blockchain technology that got me even thinking about this. Because we haven't had this consensus, decentralized consensus organizational model has existed within the sphere of human beings for a long time, and particularly within communities of women. This is just how it is. Yeah. This is just how women interact. They have their own hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy based on consensus, where it's these momentary pops up, right? They may look to somebody as a particular authority, but it's not hierarchical type of authority. It's like one level up. Everybody's here, and then, oh, she's above everybody else, or he's an alpha, right? So it's more of an alpha beta situation rather than a hierarchical chain of command. They've had it for so very long, but it's so hard to have on a mass scale. The technology required for a consensus, a working consensus-based model requires a level of communication that we've never had in human history to be able to have, for instance, tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of miners all mining and sharing consensus instantaneously on the blockchain. That is so new. But social media also does it, right? So a hashtag is that. The Me Too movement is a consensus.
Yeah.
And you see that there's actual power, like powerful people are being laid low by hashtags, dude. So this is new. This is very new. And if we can get a handle on what it is, we can actually have some positivity come out of it. Otherwise, we're going to struggle through it for a much, much longer.
Well, and I think like in politics, Aristotle talks about it, where the most dangerous thing is to have basically the mass, or like, you know, the democracy being mobilized by demagoguery. And I think that's what you see with social media. It is, you know, the masses, the mob, that's a consensus that they've come together against this person or this thing.
That's right.
And so when you have a leader that can lead you astray quickly, or can rile you up in fear or anger and prey on those things, then you can make really bad decisions as a consensus. If you're deliberate and slow as a consensus, then you get that evolutionary, growth that, I don't know. I think you see it with like with Bitcoin even. Like Bitcoin took that consensus quickly to the SegWit, and it really derailed a lot of what it was doing. And then you have Bitcoin Cash kind of staying true to what it is, and now it's really much more functional because it's slower to adopt these technologies that are popular.
This is an important point. So consensus is always slow, but it's slow to change once consensus has been reached. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have some aberrant situation where consensus is reached very quickly, right? So you can have mutations inside the consensus. And this is when consensus gets dangerous. This is what you're describing, is that when you have, it doesn't have to be a leader, because it's not really about leaders, it's about memes. Consensus is about memes like genes, right? So you can have the equivalent of a cultural virus that enters, right? And it's a pathogen, and the genes they come in and they spread, boom, right? So it's like a flu, because an epidemiology is really all about consensus, right? You're looking for a vector, and then if you look at a map, the virus is getting consensus, right? It's getting into every single thing. So the problem is, once it's in there, consensus is very difficult to, because it's so rare that you can insert a virus, it's very difficult to insert the antidote because you have to insert the antidote almost in the same way that it has to go in and then start breaking the virus up that's in there. So this is the problem that you have, is that if you get a situation where you have mass consensus, and that's where I think we are, and then a meme gets in there that's a powerful meme that there's no defense for, that consensus has not seen before, and there's no defense, it immediately spreads very, very far, and it can be pathological. And at that point, it's almost impossible to actively try to ameliorate or change, because it's, how do you change consensus? It's like trying to change the meaning of the word CAT.
Yeah.
How would you do that? So this is what I think we are seeing happen. And people are saying, oh, it's leftists, and no, not at all. This is an aberration of memes. And I think that basically what the meme is it's being, I think we're getting much closer to it as people start talking about, like, oh, it's postmodernism, it's Marxism. No, I think what we're seeing is Marxism was one of those memes that was able to catch on at another time. And so it was a consensus-based pathology. And so it's one of those ones that takes in that same way. So people are, I think, maybe conflating the two. But I think what it really is we had reached consensus in the West that, and it goes to a matriarchal idea that was inserted into the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, right? That is not a patriarchal idea. That is a completely matriarchal insertion into something that was previously a patriarchal idea. So this is a positive piece of the matriarchy. You could say this is the Blessed Mother, right? This is the insertion of, and we had talked on Twitter where I had said, Christianity, the best part of it is matriarchal, and it is that we all have this immortal soul, and that God is we are God's children now, not slaves. It's not the Lord, it's the Father, right? And this notion, all men created equal, this is a matriarchal notion. And at that time, in its kernel, it was the Blessed Mother, because it worked very well. It was trying to fight against the patriarchy. Now, it works so damn well that we reached a point over the last several generations where really the consensus in society was, oh yeah, all people are created equal. And oh yeah, like discriminating against other people based on the color of their skin is terrible. And then, well, not just the color of their skin, discriminating on people based on their sex and their gender and their sexual orientation and their place of birth and their ethnicity and their language group and their religion. All of this is terrible, 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 terrible. Okay, fine. That's where you reach this point, and that's about probably where it should be. But then discrimination, when you cross into discrimination itself, the idea and concept of treating human beings differently, itself is not good. You've now crossed into the pathology, the devouring mother, because this is where you cross into insanity. Because the bottom line is discrimination is incredibly smart, and particularly for people who call themselves feminists to say that they are anti-discrimination. I'm like, hold on. So you're telling me any man who wants to sleep with you, you give him access, no matter what he looks like, discrimination based on appearance, no matter what he smells like, discrimination based on odor, no matter how tall he is or short he is, height discrimination, right? No matter any of those things, no matter how much money he has, class discrimination. Oh, you don't do any of that. So a broke midget who stinks like shit, and he says he wants to sleep with you, you're like, okay, spread your legs? No, of course not, because discrimination is, we have to discriminate.
Well, it's making choices between things.
It's choices, right? So where we've crossed the line now is we've crossed the line into, from, if we're going to have a state, this was the idea. if we're going to have a state and there is going to be a monopoly on violence, then the ideal state would not levy that violence against certain individuals based on things that they could not control.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
But when that is lost, when the understanding is not, when it becomes, and this is what happens with tradition, is that it basically becomes a cargo cult. This is how consensus falls apart, is that the reasons that things came up, and this happens often in religions as well, the reasons that things came up become lost. Yeah. It becomes lost to tradition. It becomes lost to ritual. It's just how we always did it. That's consensus. Yeah. And then a meme comes up within that is off from the original purpose. But that meme is able to catch on because it carries enough of that mimetic material that it's like, oh yeah, discrimination is bad. And then it's just a pathology. And that's what we've reached at this point, is we've got pathological matriarchy that's building and building and building on top of itself. And it's going to be very difficult to halt, or I don't even know. I don't know if it has to break the society apart, which is kind of, I think, what the devouring mother ends up doing, just like the tyrant ends up doing. I don't know if our entire society has to fall apart because of this, because it just rises to a point where it's like nothing makes sense anymore.
Well, and yeah, it's to the point where even with discrimination, it doesn't make sense, where you have feminists saying that, talking about the wage gap and all this, and at the same time, I just saw like articles where they have like a women-only island, and like,
of course,
it's because it's to the point where discrimination is so bad that it's good to discriminate against basically the people who historically have been discriminatory against the groups that are, the groups that feel discriminated against, they can discriminate back.
Yeah, it's the Karl Popper idea of it's okay to be intolerant against those who are intolerant.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it doesn't make sense. And the funny thing is, the way you kill the intolerance is through being, tolerant and giving them the platform. And you just
absolutely
people, like, if anyone hears, someone spew Nazi ideas, you're like, you're an idiot. Like,
let them talk. Yeah. Like if you want to make it so that people aren't racist, like put a Nazi and a KKK member on the stage and then just let them talk. I mean, it was great when, like, back in the 80s, Geraldo and Oprah and Donahue, they used to have these white supremacists on talking, and they were just idiots, right? But at the same time, they would have like Nation of Islam, like black nationalists, and they sounded stupid too. Like, they all sounded dumb, And so I think but that's a very, very important point. But that comes from the patriarchy, right? Because the patriarchy is an idea of, if you have authority and this person can change, and like this becomes very, very, very clear, is this is how all authoritative structures. This is why in a corporation you have a board of directors, right? The idea is there's one person who's going to make a decision. This is either going to be the president or the CEO. He has a decision to make, just like the president, any president of a nation, right? Authoritative hierarchy. He's like, okay, I need to make a decision. He's got all of these advisors. These advisors may disagree with each other, right? And so, but they all get together and cordially, because they're all supposed to be on the same team, going for the exact same goal. Again, we're right back to this situation. This is how far back it goes. Yeah. It's built right into the psychology and the physiology. And then they say, well, here's my idea. And the authority says, okay. All right. And then makes a decision based on which one seems to be the most reason. So when you have a scenario like that, you imagine 10,000 years, right? And you've got 10,000 years of civilization. You've got 10,000 years of these advanced hierarchies. Well, over time, there becomes a huge demand for a system through which we can determine which one of these decisions is the best decision. And through that, you get science. Now, because the initial advisors you go back to Egypt, or you go back to Sumeria, the initial advisors were also the proto-scientists. I mean, it was the priest class.
Mhm.
Egypt in particular, which is where so much of our culture comes from, because that's where Judaic culture came out of. I mean, Moses was the adopted son of the Pharaoh,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So this is where in Judeo-Christian, in the Western world, which is the Christian world, I mean, that's it, or the Islamic world as well, because that came out of that same Judeo-Christian context. I mean, Muhammad was pulling from the Torah and from the teachings of Jesus. Like, so this is our culture. This is what Western culture is based upon. It comes from out of Egypt. And the reasons that the priests had a place was because of the unique geography of Egypt, which was the flooding of the Nile was what enabled their entire civilization. And they could predict the flooding of the Nile by the rising of the star Sirius at a very particular place. There's some evidence that was that had been back 16,000 years. There's a place called Nab Taplaya. It's in the Sudanese desert, where they have, it's like a Stonehenge almost, that predicts this particular rising. They can tell, and by measuring, by going back in terms of where that procession would have been, they could say, okay, it was either this year built, this year, because it lines up. So they were the proto-scientists from the beginning, these priests, and they were the advisors of the pharaoh, advisors of the king. And so the idea of logic and reason, statistics, observation, these tools are all a part of the authoritative hierarchical structure, to the point where you get so advanced that you don't even need a king anymore, because you have a scientific method. You have a methodology that you can judge things against, that you follow this, and then people can peer review, they can do all of that. So you can see how very, very deeply these two concepts permeate every aspect of our culture and how they got to the place that they are. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge demand right now, because we have a connection of people in instant communication, even face-to-face, even in our pockets with FaceTime and Skype, to anyone in the world. It takes us back into the village. And what has happened is, this is like the fertile ground for the matriarchy. Everything associated with positive and negative. Mm-hmm. It's because we have that we are able to have blockchain technology. This is a purely matriarchal economic structure that is amazing, that I absolutely love, completely decentralized. It's going to revolutionize the world, and it's going to smash the patriarchal structure, which was central banks, centralized authority that even has a pyramid on it. Yeah. You know, I mean, you couldn't, it's very, very clear what's happening here, what's going on. But at the same time, there are some things that are very positive, the authoritative things that are very positive, including science, including the rule of law, things that have evolved over this long period of time that also are at risk of being smashed. And if those are smashed, we're going to be in a very, very difficult situation, that because now there is no bulwark, there is no external place. It's not like, oh, this is happening in the Soviet Union, it's not in the US, and if the Soviet Union can collapse and the US will survive. It's not going to happen like that. It's everywhere. We have a global culture, so we have to be very careful to protect those few institutions that are holding things together still, because if they're gone, we could be back in the Dark Ages, really. I mean, that's what the collapse of Rome was about.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that, I mean, I started what I'm doing right now because I was listening to a bunch of podcasts, and, you know, you'd hear people talk about like the conversation, the dialogue and everything on this alternative media space. There was all these people, and, you know, they kind of had this loose connection of they're exploring ideas together in this, I don't know, this space through podcasts, YouTube, and all the platforms that you have. And I felt like, I was like, what I want to do is get involved in it just somehow. But I think that there's nowhere in this space where there's no, like, I don't know, there's no patriarchal system in it that says, here's the best people rising to the top. It's your, like you said in the beginning, it's whatever content you consume gets fed back to you. So there's no, like Steam, it's the closest that you get really, where the best content that everyone's liking goes to the top of your feed. right? It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone has an equal vote in that, and it pops to the top. And so I think that that's kind of the systems that almost need to be, built into the alternative media, where, the best keep rising to the top, so that you have the best ideas, the things that most people are following along with. And, the Jordan Peterson, like what he's doing, obviously is rising to the top. I mean, he has thousands of people listening to him talk about like 2 lines in Genesis, like for an hour. And so, those kinds of people, they need to have the ability to sort through and find what that new consensus is going to be. I think that system is important to have, and I think that there, obviously with technology, there's a huge potential for that. And that's kind of where I'd like to take what I do, is saying that, different people can come in and write and put stuff on my platform, and you can kind of have that competition of ideas, and the best ideas rise to the top.
I think this is a very important point that you're bringing up here, and particularly I had not thought of it this way before, but in this context, it really works. I mean, if we think about YouTube and we think about what Google is trying to do with their particular algorithmic model, right? They're trying to keep you locked in,
Mm-hmm.
and that is coming from an authoritative. There is a hierarchical idea of, well, how are we organizing this algorithm?
Mm-hmm.
How are we feeding this person information? And what are we now? We're seeing the censorship as well, which is clearly from a patriarchal, authoritative stand, but curiously is being enacted by these same individuals, these SJWs, who say that they're trying to smash the patriarchy, but yet, but you're the authority with your hand on the button to do the censorship, right? So that's a purely authoritative model. And I think that you are right that seeing the rise of Steemit and the idea that, okay, here is an actual, I think it's, and yours.org is another one, right? I don't know that these two are going to be the two, but this is a model. And one of the things that's interesting that Ryan Charles said that I found fascinating. So we're talking about this, the Russian troll farms and everything, right? That's in the news, and how they're affecting the narrative and news and all of this. So Ryan Charles has yours.org, which is like a Bitcoin Cash powered Steemit.
Okay.
Same idea, you upvote, but you actually have to pay to upvote. It actually is going to cost you something. You have to have some skin in the game. That's the idea with Steemit as well. Mm-hmm. And that it actually goes to the content creator when you do this upvote. And he's like, there's no trolling on yours.org.
Yeah.
Because trolls don't want to spend the money. And even if they do, well, that's great. Troll me, please. Troll my content, because every time you troll me, I get paid. And I think that shows truly it is the only way to measure what is truly valuable to the vast majority of people, is what is it that people are purchasing. This is how we take it into the free market, because although YouTube is free to use, it is not a free market, because the viewer is the product, right? Yeah. The eyeballs of the viewer is the product. Like, all you are is you are just as a content creator on YouTube, you're just kind of a form of capital, right? You're just the tools that you're the bait, right? They're fishermen trying to sell fish to the advertisers. The fish is the audience. You are a worm wriggling on a hook. And that's why they have no problem discarding people. Yeah. And people are like, oh, censorship, it's this. And it's like, you're a worm, bro. Mm-hmm. You're a worm. Just realize that going in. You might be able to become a fat worm, because they're going to give you food to fatten you up so that you're nice and juicy. Mm-hmm. They're happy to feed you, so long as you attract lots of fish for them to sell off to the advertisers, no problem. But just understand what you are in this situation. But Steemit and yours and whatever is going to come next, this is a super interesting model not just from the idea that, of course, content creators can get paid. That's great. And that's important. But the value that you can have to say, oh, this is what's generating consensus. Oh, this is what people really, truly believe. Not trolls, not manipulated. Because it's going to be over time, if it's worth it to manipulate, it's going to be so expensive for you to manipulate it. Right? Does that make sense? The economics of that? It's like when Steemit had reached the point where, for instance, you could troll Steemit to elect Hillary Clinton as president, or to elect Donald Trump as president, it will be so expensive that it will be not economically viable to do so. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, especially on Steemit, because if you're creating all these accounts, they don't actually have the steam power to affect the changes. You have to build the credibility as well. So you have the two-sided thing. So if you're a content creator, I mean, if you get all the content creators that are at the top, maybe you could do something, but
But how hard is that?
But that would be betraying their own economic interests.
Exactly, right? They couldn't do something that would lose them. Sure, if they were at the top and they really believed this and this was authentic to their message, sure. But they're going to do it anyway. If it's authentic to their message, you're not even going to need to pay them to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a very, and this is why what is his name? Jacques Ellul, I believe, is the guy's name. It's the technological, what is it? The Technological Age is, I believe, the book. But he says there are no political solutions, only technological ones. All the rest is propaganda. And it's true. Here's we're talking about. Here's the technological solution, right? And there's a lot of I see a lot of people complaining. I see a lot of people in the space complaining, and more daily. Oh, the YouTube purge, they're purging us. I do not see these people migrating to these other platforms.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, especially with Alex Jones as a prime example, that I'm like, look, dude, if you moved over to these other platforms, they would be huge tomorrow. If you just said, look, we're closing our YouTube account because of this, people will leave YouTube. If you want to hurt, you could hurt Google so much by leaving, but you're not leaving.
Yeah.
Right. So and they know you're not leaving. This was the same situation with that. I remember when Howard Stern went to Sirius, to Sirius XM, right? He left terrestrial radio and went to satellite radio, and it blew up satellite radio. But I remember thinking to myself at the time, streaming radio was very, very nascent at the time. You still couldn't really do it in your car. And I was actually I had built the internet radio station for Cal State Dominguez Hills, and I was commuting back and forth to go to work. I was working as a radio station coordinator there at the time that Howard Stern left. And I remember thinking, oh, this is such a bad move on his part. He should just it's all going to be internet streaming radio. It's all going to be over the internet. And eventually it's going to be on phones. Like, I already knew that. I was experimenting with the early stuff. And I was like, oh, Howard Stern's going to blow it. He's going to take this $40 million when he could have $40 billion and be able to do way more things that he wants to do, and be able to really launch, or do a podcast.
Yeah.
You imagine like if Howard Stern would have done a podcast that was pre-Joe Rogan. You imagine how that would have just taken things and shot it into the stratosphere, right? And it's at all of these moments that, for those people who are listening who do a podcast, that it's like, just go there now. Go there now, because we're already talking about where things are going to be. I think we can clearly see that this is the future, and that it's only going to take one or two big names leaving from the current paradigm, jumping into this other thing that's a better representation of something good coming out of this matriarchal consensus-based system, seeing it for what it is, not being quantitative about it, right? Just making an observation that these two energies exist. We're seeing a shift in these energies. Let's roll with always be on the lookout for what is decentralized, what is consensus-based, because that's going to win right now. We're having a massive shift. Like, put your money there, because that's who's coming up. It's like, that's the Facebook to the old ways MySpace. it's on its way out. This other way is on its way up. So you may as well invest right there. I mean, that's the play.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's how, I mean, I think that this basic paradigm of this shift has been what's kind of created the West. I think you saw it in Greece when
Sure.
with the basically the sophists kind of got pushed out of the philosophical discussion, and we know Aristotle and Socrates and Plato because they were who they were, you know. And there's a, I mean, I went through a book. It's the first Greek or the first philosophers, and it goes through all the Greek philosophers before that, and just kind of like 5 pages on their basic understanding.
Right.
And like some of those ideas that like of the origin of the world and all these things. And then there's some people who are like, yeah, the world's got to be made up of some sort of atom, like, and that's I mean, they just thought about it and deduced that idea, and they're like, that just has to be the makeup of things.
Mm-hmm.
And like, as when someone else is like, no, it's, you know, it's just fire inside of Earth, and that's what makes things. And then you're like, no, but. And so, but they were deducing basically things that in 1,000 years science would be able to prove, or 2,000 years even.
Mm-hmm.
And but they had the idea. And then you have with the printing press and coming, you know, when that came along, you have this same thing where basically you could create the new consensus on religion, and that's what changed the shape of Europe for.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
that was the biggest change in the West by far that ever happened. Yeah.
Yeah, and so now you have basically out of that you have the rise of the individual, because the Catholic Church had the monopoly on what was true, and then you have people reading the Bible for themselves in their native language that they could say, oh, this is different than, this isn't what my priest said up at the altar, you know, up at in the pulpit, and so they could kind of question things and grow and learn as an individual. And then in America, when it came along, the founding fathers did the same exact thing, and I think now we sit on this opportunity here where, you know, or actually even in the Industrial Revolution you had that, and now we have the technological revolution is where I think the Industrial Revolution went the wrong way in consensus, because you have the labor unions and the Marxist ideas that took hold and won, really.
Absolutely.
And most throughout the world. I mean, America is the only country that stood against that. Even Europe's fallen to it in a large part.
But America's there too. I mean, even it's a different form of socialism. But Marx, I mean, the thing about Marx is that Marxism as a prescription and a program of what to do doesn't work very well. But Marx, his description of what he saw that the world was, and it was spot on. Absolutely. Like, you talk about economic minds, like top 3 greatest economic minds in terms of description, in terms of seeing like, oh, this is how the world works. And he was seeing it at a time that it was like the proto beginning. He was predicting what was going to come. There were no factories really when he was writing what he was writing. He was seeing and predicting so much. Now, how he prescribed behavior, he was just pulling that out of his ass, right? So that was an opinion. That wasn't sort of revealed wisdom, and some tiny amount of it. Again, it's that thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So everywhere in the world has a synthesis of socialist ideas. Like, we have so much socialism throughout the West. Karl Marx is a Western thinker. You know what I mean? He's a product of the West. His ideas are of the West, and you know, if anything, that's why it's because of Marxism that China was able to enter into the global marketplace and interact with the West and have some sort of, you know, the Chinese premier wears a 3-piece suit. You know what I mean? They're as Western as anybody else. So Marx, if there's anybody who has moved Western culture to places where it otherwise probably could not have moved because of the cultural connection to religion and language and all of those things, and particular legal codes, I mean, it's been Marx that has opened the door for Western culture to flow in. So, but what we're seeing now, I do not think that necessarily that. I think the technological revolution is almost over. I think that what we are coming into now, I don't even know how you would phrase it, but we are becoming a new species at this point, I believe. And this is, you know, what I've been trying to communicate this idea that when we first came up as a species, when human beings first arrived on the scene, those first humans, there had to have been one family, right? Like the species started from one group of individuals, and for many, who knows how long, the species was just those individuals, maybe some large family group, maybe a tribe that spread across some amount of land, but they all were able to communicate with each other in person, vocally, to see each other, to touch each other. Every other human being on the planet could communicate, because there were very few, could communicate with every other. And then at some point, maybe 1,000,000 years ago, they got too big, broke up, or some group went to go in search of more resources. And from that point on, we were out of touch with the other human beings that existed in the universe. And we've now reached the point, I think, that all of what we've gone through and everything that was prehistory and history, if there's an energy that's underneath it, if there's a goal and a reason that's underneath it, and I think it's what so many religions in particular are speaking to, if there was a spiritual energy and goal, it is to get back to that all men are your brothers, you're a single family. But to really experience that, we have to talk with each other. We have to be able to see each other as we are now. Every other human being on the planet, instantaneously, in real time, and we're getting closer and closer because there's such a demand for better communication. We're getting closer and closer, and I think that at the point when consensus is reached that, yes, we are back to that point where I can reach out instantly to every other human being on the planet. I can at least see and hear them, but maybe it's going to get to the point with virtual reality where I feel like I can touch them as well. That's the reset button. That's the reset button. And where we are at that moment is potentially going to determine the next 1,000,000 years. That's going to determine what is this species as we spread out of this planet.
Yeah.
And go to, in the same way that, that initial split I'm talking about was when we left out of some little small area in Ethiopia or wherever it was, where those first human beings were in the highlands of Ethiopia, or where the plains of sub-Saharan Africa, wherever the hell it was. That moment, we're about to have that moment again, and it could be in our lifetime. And so wherever we are, that's going to be our starting point. And I hope that our starting point is one that's a little healthier. I think it will be. I think it has to be. It has to balance out. But it's not just going to balance out on its own. We have to, if we are having this conversation, it's because we are being driven by something to seek that balance. And that it's incumbent on everyone as individuals, if they value that balance, to play their own part in this particular piece of the human experience. To not just be a bystander, and to actually play a part, because you're not a bystander. Everybody is playing a part. And just by sitting on the sidelines, you're playing a part, and it might not be the part that you want to play.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're describing really, and that fracturing is basically the story of Babel, really. It's that idea of, everyone was together in this one place working towards that thing. And then, they were confused. They got confused, their tongues, they split apart. And I think that if you can get everyone, I can Google translate in any language. You can, language is becoming less and less of a barrier. Obviously, technology is becoming less and less of a barrier. And you can get people into that one group again. But I think the key, what happened in Babel is that they were, doing this out of hubris and out of, basically, they were saying they could reach God and become like God. And I think that you have to remember that whatever you're building together has to be within the order of the universe, right? The man cannot be God. And so when they betrayed the order of the universe, then God had to step in, basically, is the idea. And so if we're going to build something, we have to build something that's within the consensus of nature, that was within the order, right? We can see the order. We know that there's natural law. You have to follow along that and build the consensus, build that, that thing in line with what's real and what's really physically around us, within that reality, that observable, world that we can see and touch and feel. We have to know that we're working within that, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, and it does bring up the idea of. By the way, I think that you're absolutely right that is what the story of the Tower of Babel is about. That's exactly what that story is trying to communicate. The question is, is it communicating that is an inevitable situation, or is there, because I think that is when we start to get into this idea of perhaps you might, the vernacular would be to say the kingdom of God,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can we reach a balance within our society where is that our destiny? Is our destiny to be able to reach a place where we are in enough balance where we can have 1,000,000 years of that balance being there? I think it is the destination.
Mm-hmm.
I think it starts with the individual for sure, and that's what the great sages of all time have said. It's that it's first for you to get into that balance, for you to recognize that balance with nature, with God, with Gaia, with whatever metaphor is the most powerful. And for me, I don't care what the metaphor is, and I think that all of the metaphors should be allowed to stay out there, because whatever one truly motivates somebody to adopt a life where they pursue that balance, where they pursue that sort of that righteous action, whatever it is, that needs to be available to as many people as possible, and you need to spread it with all of your might in the hope that someone else will also glom onto it. So whatever it is that structure that can help us to reach that point, I'm hopeful that is a destination for us.
Yeah.
However, or at least I think it's a great orientation.
Yeah.
I have some feeling, and it's in my own reading, and I've spent a long time reading and analyzing Genesis, and I do believe that what is being written in there, the story that's being told, and the underlying, if you would call hidden or occult meaning, that's in the occult, just meaning hidden. I don't mean occult like worshiping Satan or something, but just the hidden meaning, which would make sense coming from a priest of Egypt, right? Someone who was trained in the Egyptian mystery schools to be able to write at multiple levels, which they did. Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that it's talking about cycles that are perhaps inevitable, and that even if we do reach that balance for some period of time, that the nature of that part of that balance with nature is the introduction of some mutation, pathogen, environmental variable, something that makes the tower crash. And I think that we can find that balance again only if, as we build that tower, as you say, front of mind, we have the idea that this is potentially only temporary, and it may crumble to the ground, and the only way that we'll be able to rebuild it quickly and not have to go through the entire suffering for millions or hundreds or thousands of years is for us to keep front of mind this idea of righteousness through the entire process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that that's 100% correct, that you have basically in both Eastern and Western thought, you have Jesus and Lao Tzu talking about the way, and that's that thing, that's that order that when you walk within it, you feel the balance, you feel the peace, right? You know that you're in it because you feel it, right? And so, and you have that, and then you also have, in my opinion, where an absolute truth that is discoverable to a point, right? There's no way that humans can fully understand full truth, but as we get closer and closer, and as you're able to store knowledge and keep knowledge, you can get closer to it. That between those two things, that you can observe the order, and that we can continually work on knowing what it is that the way that this order of the universe around of the world around us, as you get closer and closer to that end, to that asymptote, basically, you never can hit the asymptote, but as you get closer, you can maintain things for longer, you can maintain things better. And so obviously there'll be crap, and there, it's probably not going to look like, your graph of the exponential function. It's going to be a lot messier, but you can have that. I think that as you get closer, you recognize that you're getting closer to that asymptote. And if you can continue to work along those lines, and if you orient yourself with that in mind, then you know where you're going, and you know that there's always an improvement. You can always be better. You can always get closer to that objective, that absolute truth, walk closer within the order of the world, the way.
Yeah, and I mean, that directly goes to why I value individualism so much, that any approach, if you want to improve the world, you're going to have to go internally and improve your soul, really, first, right? You're going to have to get yourself in line with the way. And this is just, if there is an absolute truth, I think, you go from all the way from, Jesus or Lao Tzu, or you go to Mises, talking about human action and only individuals act. It's like, it just shows itself to be, it's just true. It's as true as those Greeks saying, well, the world must be made out of atoms. This idea of the individual is the center of the universe. Individual consciousness is the pinnacle. And the reason it's the pinnacle is because if you get your individual consciousness right, like, you've done your part. You've done your part.
Yeah.
And that's the best that you can do for the world, is to do your part. And I think that it stands in direct opposition. And it's clearly, we can experience the fact that that's true by being in a room full of people who are dedicated to improving themselves as individuals. And that is their idea of how to change the world. Or being in a room full of people who believe that they have to change the behavior of other people, perhaps even by force, by any means necessary, and that's how they're going to change the world. And if you've ever been in a room with those two different groups of people, I promise you, unless you're a psychopath, the room that you prefer is the one with the people who believe that their individual growth and the evolution of their own individual consciousness is the way to go.
Okay. Yeah. No, I definitely.
Did I lose you? Are you?
I know. It's saying my internet's unstable. All right. No, I think I'm good. I heard you all there. It just kind of glitched out for a sec.
Okay.
Yeah.
No problem.
No, but I definitely think that it's one of those things that it starts, like, that's why the Tao Te Ching starts with the way. It starts with, what is this thing? How do you reconcile yourself with that? And then it's, how do you act in the exterior world? And then Jesus even says, if you think lustful thoughts, then you've already started on the path, right? You've already thrown yourself out of the right way, and so I definitely think that it's going to have to be like you said, the individual taking individual efforts to make themselves better, and to use that to make the people around them better, to share, yourself, your path with other people, and get them to do that as well, right? That's why it's important for the parents to instill the values in their children first, because you can't trust that other people are going to do that. You have to take it on yourself to do that. And you have to, first, to be a good parent, you have to be a good person. If you're not able to afford your own sustenance to feed yourself, then you can't feed your children.
That's right.
So I think that's where it has to almost go. And I think that this decentralized consensus network is going to be able to facilitate that in a new way, just the same way that the printing press was able to change the way that everything else functioned. So
Yeah, we don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but I think we can have faith that it is going to happen. I think that history has borne out. I mean, there's enough of us on the planet now, and we're all communicating. There are enough minds. This is a wonderful part about how a decentralized system works, that it works at its best when there are the maximum number of participants in it. It works fastest that way. A consensus model works fastest. And, this is much more of, there has been for the last 10,000 years a struggle for the top of the hierarchy. And the people who are going to be the most successful now and who are going to feel the most fulfillment in their lives at this point, I think it's going to be very interesting, because they're going to be much less about trying hard to climb to the top of the mountain and much more about sitting in the wave and trying to learn how to ride that wave on their surfboard, because that's really what we have. We have a much more fluid dynamic rather than the raw strength that is required to climb to the top of the hierarchy and do the little Rocky dance at the top of the steps. That's not where it's at anymore. And so the crypto savage, I mean, to bring it full circle, this new person, or this new way of life that it's just going to be this. These are going to be the people who feel the most successful and the most fulfilled, are going to be those people who gain enough knowledge to get a glance into the future, to see where this wave is going, to learn, in many ways, to feel the wave, because more than anything, you're a part of this consensus. So it's inside of you. You're going to feel, and to be able to use. I think this is where it being, pure of heart. This idea that really what that pure of heart is to be able to push your ego to the side, to be able to have some faith in your own feelings internally, to clear yourself out, to have to have some self-purification, right? To purify yourself. But the reason that you're purifying yourself is not because that suddenly makes you a good person and better than everybody else. No, it's a very practical reason. You purify yourself so that you can feel which way this thing is pulling, and so that you can move in that direction without resistance. And this is going to be an entirely new paradigm. It's going to require a new level of spirituality, but I think we have all of the tools. The great masters of the past have given us all of the tools. If we'll look back, but now we can actually we can use them. I think that we're approaching, I call it like a new age of magic, right? So I do think that we are approaching a time when, we're already in a time when if you were to tell somebody about us having this conversation in the way that we are 1,000 years ago, I mean, this is magic. Yeah. This is magic, what we're doing right now. I mean, this is like a crystal ball, or looking in the water and the thing, and the sorcerer is like, oh, I can see he's going around, and it's like, no, we're doing that right now. So we're in a new age of magic, and I think that to have that spiritual basis, to understand that the universe is much bigger than we think, and that a lot of these ideas that have been expressed for so very long by the great spiritual masters, we can really actually use in the real world right now, and not in some woo-woo way, but in a real way, to actually manifest some real things in the world. It's a pretty amazing time, man.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's the point, is that the idea has to start, right? It's the word and the idea, the thought that begins, and then you have to have, the ability to nurture that idea and to make it real, right? The entrepreneur has this idea, and then he has to find the capital and the right thing, and all of these right circumstances have to kind of be met before he can make his business happen. And everything, like Da Vinci, his idea is like, it took 500 years to be able to build some of them, or he was almost there on some of them. He just didn't have like a vent in his parachute. It would have worked, but you would have stayed in the air forever. And then someone took that idea and made it, tweaked it, and it became real. And all those there's so many times that people have been so ahead of their time that they seem crazy, but it's because people can't envision how an idea becomes real until the circumstances are right. And this is like my argument with my dad all the time, is like, he tells me that I'm like, for being a voluntarist anarchist, he's like, no, you're talking about the same thing that the socialist is. You're talking about like, utopia. I'm like, no, I'm just talking about the fact that this is the way things are going to go, I think, towards that, because technology is going to take us there. Technology has brought us here. And I think that the ideas that we've talked about, those are going to come to fruition, right? I think that
very quickly too. Very, very, very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think about I have to constantly remind myself of this, but think about how difficult it would be to have spread these ideas that we're talking. Well, we know how difficult it was. I mean, the Murray Rothbards and the Ludwig von Mises, like, you had to write books, you had to be within the academy. It was so much work, and you were still some little niche guy that nobody outside of your particular field knew about. And now it's like, no, man, I've just got my laptop, I've got I've got my earbuds, and I'm good. Like, it's time to go spread the message, and millions of people can hear it. And not just that it has that viral aspect, that it's like, you don't know, because you don't know, even if you personally are not reaching 1 million people, like, you don't know how many other people you are influencing who are spreading the message, and that message that originally came sort of from you, germinated from you, hits somebody else, and they're the one. Like, you don't Jesus had 12 disciples, but Paul, you know what I mean? Like, come on. And so you never know who you are in that whole mix. You never know. And John the Baptist only had one disciple that we really care about at all. You know what I mean? So it's like it travels in waves, and think about how difficult and how long that process took. Mm-hmm. But you imagine if Jesus had a podcast. So we're in a place right now where it's a very, very amazing time. Everybody should be participating in it. Like, I mean, it is a conversation, and it is going to happen. Like, all of these things that we're talking about are going to happen, because none of and I'm a voluntarist for the same reason that you are, because I look at the landscape of what the world is going to look like, and it's pretty clear what the world is going to look like if you do a logical progression. And I'm like, okay, no other philosophy is logically consistent and ethically and morally consistent. And no other philosophy is going to work in this new environment.
Yeah,
they're all going to fall by the wayside. So why would I even why bank on something that's just going to be irrelevant in 20 years? Let me go with the thing that's relevant now, and that will be even more relevant 20 years from now, and probably 100 years from now. So that's, it's a very good point. Very good point.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of why I titled this The Conversation of Our Generation, is that I'm like, I think this has to be that sorting out. I think that, like you were talking about the wave and the surfer, I took a surf lesson one time, and the guy said that I was like looking backwards, and I would look and see the wave coming. And he's like, the one thing that you do well that most beginners don't do is you pick the right wave. And he said that's the hardest thing for most beginners to get, is to see which wave that you need. Which one's going to be at the right place. Can you catch this wave, or is that wave going to be past you by the time you paddle up to it? And so I saw kind of this movement, I kind of did that environmental scan, and I just kind of saw like what was going on. I'm like, okay, this is my place where I can step in. And I think that everybody who has something that they want to say needs to find that place where they can step in and say something, because like, I like Dave Rubin's show for that reason, because he pulls these people who this is their place. Like they have like this, a lot of times, like these niche things that they're amazing at, and he pulls them out, and that you can see just like this macro, all these consequences that come from like this person's work. And they knew what they were doing, whether it's the Weinstein, the Weinstein brother, Brett and Weinstein, and they're evolutionary biologists. And when they talk about things, they kind of talk about like what you do with this is how the male and female thing, where, you have to understand those things now, because we have to know that, because people are attacking that idea and that institution. And so Jordan Peterson's another example, obviously, and so I think that everybody needs to find that spot where they can step in and they can see that wave that they can catch. And I think that that's how we change the landscape, really, is finding our wave.
I agree. Great point. Yeah, man. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. All right. It was awesome talking to you, and I'm sure that I'll be talking to you on Twitter more, and we'll maybe do this again sometime. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. So as I'm working on a second book, which will be out I'm thinking probably July or August, and some of these concepts will be in there, but they're not fully articulated for me yet. So maybe the initial pieces of these concepts will be in there. So maybe after, maybe when the book comes out, if you read it and you like it, we can have a discussion about it. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to.
All right, man.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.